In a single day, $12 billion vanished. Not from a stock market crash. Not from a natural disaster. From a calculated act of economic warfare between the two closest allies on Earth. February 2025 marked the moment when handshake deals were replaced with clenched fists, when 70 years of trust evaporated overnight, and when the world's most peaceful border became an economic battlefield. This isn't a story about tariffs and trade statistics. This is a story about how Washington's attempt to protect American steel triggered the most devastating friendly fire in modern economic history. And here's the terrifying part: neither side knows how to stop the bleeding. On February 10, 2025, the Trump administration announced a sweeping expansion of Section 232 national security tariffs, imposing a blanket 25% tariff on all steel imports worldwide, effective March 12. The detail that transformed routine protectionism into diplomatic crisis was eliminating all country-specific exemptions. For years, Canada had enjoyed special status recognizing the deeply integrated nature of the two economies. That morning, without consultation or notice, that exemption vanished. Canadian steel would be treated identically to steel from China or Russia. Washington's rationale was straightforward: protect American jobs, rebuild domestic manufacturing, reduce foreign dependence. The immediate market reaction seemed validating. U.S. steel surged 8%, Cleveland-Cliffs jumped 12%. Investors anticipated massive windfalls as foreign competitors faced crippling price disadvantages. American steel producers, suddenly shielded from competition, appeared poised to dominate their home market. But this narrative ignored fundamental economic reality. Canada isn't just another trading partner. It's America's largest export market, purchasing over $307 billion in goods annually according to 2024 Census Bureau data. More critically, the economies aren't merely connected through trade agreements but physically integrated through supply chains built over 70 years. Steel crosses the border multiple times during single manufacturing processes. A coil might be produced in Hamilton, shipped to Detroit for processing, returned to Canadian assembly, then sold in American showrooms. This isn't traditional trade but a unified production system spanning a border. Section 232 didn't just tax imports. It threw a wrench into North American manufacturing machinery itself. The broader market understood what celebrating steel executives didn't. The Dow dropped 1.2% that day, the S&P 500 fell 0.9%, the Nasdaq declined 1.1%. Investors recognized that starting trade wars with your biggest customer and most integrated supplier is economic self-harm dressed as nationalism. Wall Street's nervous response proved prescient. Within 36 hours, Canada would demonstrate exactly how much leverage it possessed. Section 232, passed in 1962 during the Cold War, allows presidents to impose tariffs on imports deemed national security threats. For decades this remained dormant, invoked only for genuinely strategic materials. That changed in 2018 when Trump revived it as a blunt instrument to reshape global trade. Initial 2018 steel tariffs sparked international outcry and triggered EU, Chinese, and Canadian retaliation. After negotiations, the administration granted exemptions to close allies including Canada and Mexico in exchange for quotas. This compromise held until 2025. The 2025 reimposition differed critically. It eliminated all exemptions, treating allies and adversaries identically, raised rates in stages, eventually reaching 50% on Canadian steel by June, and expanded coverage to derivative products, multiplying complexity and damage. Historical precedent suggested Canadian response, but the scale and precision caught Washington off guard. Previous Canadian reactions followed predictable patterns: diplomatic protests, appeals to shared values, legal challenges through NAFTA or WTO, limited symbolic retaliation. February 2025 broke that pattern entirely. Canada had learned restraint was interpreted as weakness. This time, Ottawa chose overwhelming force. On March 13, 2025, just 24 hours after U.S. tariffs took effect, Canada announced comprehensive retaliation targeting $29.8 billion Canadian dollars, approximately 20.7 billion US dollars worth of American goods. The list was a masterpiece of economic and political targeting. Its core was dollar-for-dollar assault on American steel and aluminum, 25% tariffs on $12.6 billion of U.S. steel exports and $3 billion of aluminum products. But Canada went further, targeting automobiles threatening Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana manufacturing jobs, agricultural products from swing states including Florida orange juice, Wisconsin dairy, Iowa corn, and iconic consumer goods like Kentucky bourbon. Every product was chosen for maximum political impact, creating immediate congressional pressure across both parties. The message was unmistakable: you cannot inflict pain on Canada without experiencing equivalent pain. For American steel companies, implications were catastrophic. They celebrated domestic market protection but suddenly faced complete loss of their most profitable export market. Canada had accounted for roughly 16% of total U.S. steel exports in 2024, representing billions in annual revenue. That market had effectively vanished behind a 25% tariff wall. Initial stock price surges began reversing as reality sank in. The trade war had entered a far more dangerous phase. Tariff economic logic is straightforward in theory but complex in practice. Tariffs are fundamentally import taxes paid by importing companies, typically passed to consumers or absorbed as reduced margins. Protective tariffs aim to make foreign goods expensive, giving domestic producers competitive advantage. In simple isolated markets, this can work. But modern integrated economies don't operate as isolated markets. Steel tariffs created three distinct winner and loser categories. Clear winners were a small group of American steel producers. U.S. Steel, Cleveland-Cliffs, Nucor, and Steel Dynamics operated in suddenly less competitive domestic markets. With Canadian, European, and Asian steel artificially expensive, these firms raised prices substantially. Mid-2025 industry data showed domestic steel prices increased an average 18% compared to pre-tariff levels, translating directly into higher revenues and margins. The protected environment also made companies attractive acquisition targets. The $14.1 billion Nippon Steel purchase of U.S. Steel, closing June 2025 after prolonged debate, was directly enabled by tariff-inflated valuations. Major American steel producers' shareholders reaped significant gains throughout 2025. The first loser category consisted of Canadian steel producers and workers. Facing 25% tariffs later increased to 50%, Canadian companies saw their largest export market effectively closed. Statistics Canada reported steel production dropped 5% in Q3 2025 compared to the previous year. The United Steelworkers Union documented approximately 1,000 direct layoffs in Canadian mills by mid-2025, with thousands more jobs threatened. Communities dependent on steel production, particularly Ontario's Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie industrial heartland, faced economic devastation. The Canadian government allocated emergency aid exceeding $500 million Canadian dollars to support displaced workers and assist companies finding alternative markets. But these measures only partially offset damage. The second and larger loser category consisted of American manufacturers and consumers. Any U.S. company using steel as input faced sudden cost spikes. With Canadian supply restricted and domestic producers raising prices in less competitive markets, downstream industries absorbed billions in additional costs. An RBC Economics report documented that corporate profits for U.S. fabricated metal manufacturers fell 30% between Q4 2024 and Q2 2025, directly attributable to higher input costs and supply chain disruptions. The automotive sector suffered particularly severe impacts. Modern vehicles contain approximately 1,800 pounds of steel. A 15 to 20% steel price increase added roughly $300 to $400 to each vehicle's production cost. With annual U.S. production around 10 million units, steel tariffs effectively imposed a $3 to $4 billion hidden tax on American car buyers. Canadian retaliatory tariffs compounded problems, disrupting production schedules, forcing plant closures, and eliminating cross-border sales profit margins. When the Trump administration announced on June 4, 2025 that it was doubling Canadian steel and aluminum tariffs from 25 to 50%. It crossed a threshold rarely seen between allied nations. A 50% tariff isn't a negotiating tactic but an economic blockade designed to eliminate trade entirely. Washington's justification centered on claims that 25% rates proved insufficient. Industry analysts disputed this, noting by May 2025 Canadian steel exports to the U.S. had already declined nearly 40%. The doubling served no additional protective purpose. It was punishment. Canadian government response was immediate. Officials condemned the move as unjustified escalation and economic warfare. Within days, Canada announced it would match increases with corresponding retaliatory adjustments. But more significantly, Canadian policymakers shifted from reactive retaliation to proactive restructuring. If the American market couldn't be relied upon, Canada would fundamentally reorient its industrial base. This is where Ontario, Canada's most populous province and manufacturing heartland, entered the conflict. Ontario accounts for roughly 40% of Canadian GDP and hosts the majority of auto and steel production. Premier Doug Ford, facing plant closures and rising unemployment, launched aggressive brinkmanship designed to raise political costs for American lawmakers. Ford's government threatened electricity export surtaxes to neighboring Michigan and New York, ordered the Liquor Control Board of Ontario to cease American alcohol purchases, announced by Ontario procurement policies excluding American firms from billions in provincial contracts, and publicly suggested restricting critical minerals like nickel essential for EV battery production. In practice, many threats were more political theater than actionable policy. Constitutional constraints, existing contracts, and international trade law limited Ontario's actual implementation ability. But symbolic impact was profound. The trade war escalated from technical tariff disputes between federal governments into emotionally charged multi-jurisdictional conflicts engaging provincial premiers, state governors, unions, and industry groups. Complexity and actor numbers made de-escalation increasingly difficult. When politicians on both sides publicly staked reputations on toughness, backing down became politically impossible. By late 2025, comprehensive data revealed full damage extent on both sides. In Canada, steel production contracted significantly, with year-over-year declines of 5 to 7% depending on product category. Canadian steel exports to the U.S., totaling approximately $7 billion annually pre-tariffs, fell an estimated 60 to 70%. Manufacturing employment declined nearly 10,000 positions in steel, aluminum, and related sectors during 2025's first 9 months. Pain extended beyond direct steel employment to transportation companies, ports, and service industries supporting manufacturing communities. In the United States, impact was more diffuse but equally real. While steel producer profits soared, downstream industries faced competitiveness crises. American manufacturers relying on steel inputs paid substantially more than European and Asian competitors with global market access without artificial price floors. This cost disadvantage reduced export competitiveness and squeezed margins. The auto industry, despite decades of steel tariff lobbying, found itself in impossible positions. Higher steel costs reduced profitability while Canadian retaliatory tariffs on finished vehicles eliminated major export markets. Results were production cuts, delayed investments, and mounting worker pressure. Agricultural exporters faced similar dynamics as Canadian retaliatory tariffs cut access to markets purchasing billions in U.S. farm products annually. Consumer prices rose across multiple categories. Appliances, vehicles, construction materials, and steel-intensive products became measurably more expensive. Economic analyses estimated American consumers and businesses bore approximately 75 to 80% of tariff costs, with only 20 to 25% absorbed by foreign producers through reduced margins. Tariffs functioned as regressive taxes, hitting lower and middle-income households hardest while delivering concentrated benefits to a handful of steel company shareholders. As late 2025 approached, Canada executed a strategic masterstroke. Rather than continuing tit-for-tat retaliation, Canadian policymakers shifted to long-term restructuring designed to permanently reduce American market dependence. On December 26, 2025, Canada announced new 25% tariffs on certain steel derivative products, including wire, fasteners, and wind tower components from all countries worldwide. This served multiple purposes, protecting Canadian manufacturers from cheap imports flooding markets as U.S. demand evaporated, creating incentives for domestic sourcing rather than importing semi-finished products, and signaling to international partners that Canada would aggressively defend its industrial base. Simultaneously, Canada tightened existing tariff rate quotas on steel imports from non-U.S. countries, further limiting foreign steel volumes entering Canada before triggering additional tariffs. These technical adjustments had profound practical implications, creating preference systems favoring Canadian steel for Canadian manufacturers and effectively building protective walls around domestic markets. The final and perhaps most consequential element involved systematically eliminating remission programs. For specialized steel products Canadian manufacturers couldn't source domestically, the government previously granted waivers from retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports. On November 26, 2025, Canada announced most remissions would expire January 31, 2026. The message to Canadian industry was clear and urgent: find alternative suppliers or invest in domestic capacity, because American steel will no longer be reliably accessible. This represented fundamental breaks with 70 years of economic integration. Canadian companies began actively seeking European, Asian, and Latin American suppliers. Trade missions to Japan, Korea, and Germany intensified. Domestic steel production capacity investments increased. The Canadian government provided subsidies and loan guarantees, accelerating this transition. From an American perspective, this was the nightmare scenario. Tariffs succeeded in reducing Canadian U.S. steel purchases, but rather than capitulating, Canada was methodically building alternative systems that would permanently exclude American producers even if tariffs were eventually lifted. Market access, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to recapture. Supplier-manufacturer relationships, once broken, don't easily reform. Long-term damage to American steel exporters extended far beyond immediate revenue losses. For Wall Street, the trade war created bifurcated markets with distinct winners and losers. Winners were obvious with substantial gains. Cleveland-Cliffs stock increased approximately 45% between February and October 2025. U.S. Steel shares rose roughly 35% before Nippon acquisition. Nucor and Steel Dynamics posted similar gains. Investors correctly anticipated reduced competition and higher prices translating to record profits. The tariff-protected environment sparked consolidation waves as companies sought to maximize domestic market dominance. Beyond steel, market reaction was overwhelmingly negative. The S&P 500 experienced heightened 2025 volatility with sharp sell-offs whenever escalation appeared imminent. Automotive stocks were hit particularly hard. GM, Ford, and Stellantis saw significant share price declines as investors priced in higher input costs and lost export markets. The Russell 2000, tracking smaller companies more dependent on domestic supply chains and less able to absorb cost shocks, underperformed larger cap indices throughout the year. International investors began viewing North American manufacturing as increasingly risky and unpredictable, leading to capital flight toward more stable European and Asian markets. The trade war exposed fundamental American economic policy tensions. Protecting one industry through tariffs creates ripple effects harming many others. Gains captured by a few thousand steel workers and handful of corporate shareholders came at the expense of millions in downstream industries and tens of millions of consumers paying higher prices. Economic modeling suggests that for every steel industry job saved, between 3 and 5 jobs were lost or foregone in steel-consuming industries. This isn't theoretical critique but observed reality of how protective tariffs function in integrated modern economies. Looking forward, implications extend far beyond steel and aluminum. The conflict fundamentally altered U.S.-Canada political and economic relationships. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. Canadian policymakers now operate assuming American trade policy is unpredictable and potentially hostile regardless of which party controls government. This assumption will shape Canadian economic strategy for decades. Pushes for economic diversification, reduced American market dependence, and stronger European and Asian ties will continue even if current tariffs are eventually lifted. For the United States, the trade war revealed limits of economic coercion against integrated partners. Canada proved willing and able to inflict significant reciprocal pain. The notion that the U.S. could unilaterally reshape trade relationships without serious consequences has been definitively disproven. American companies relying on seamless cross-border supply chains now face new realities of uncertainty, higher costs, and potential disruption. The upcoming United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement Review, scheduled for 2026, will occur in this context of heightened tension and mutual distrust. The agreement, which came into force in 2020 as NAFTA's replacement, includes provisions requiring the three parties to review operations after 6 years. That review was intended as routine check-in. Instead, it will now serve as a referendum on whether North American economic integration can survive in an era of resurgent nationalism and protectionism. Steel and aluminum tariffs will be central to negotiations. Canada and Mexico will almost certainly demand removal as conditions for any USMCA extension or modification. American steel producers will lobby ferociously to maintain protection. Resolution of this conflict will determine whether North America remains an integrated economic bloc or fractures into competing national economies. The $12 billion question isn't just about past damage, but what comes next. Can institutional frameworks, personal relationships, and economic incentives that sustained 70 years of cooperation be rebuilt? Or has 2025's trade war inflicted permanent damage, reshaping the continent's economic geography for generations? The answer will emerge over coming months as negotiators determine North American trade's future. What's certain is that old assumptions, comfortable beliefs in inevitable integration and mutual benefit, no longer hold. Both countries now operate in new and far more uncertain worlds where economic security is seen as more important than economic efficiency, and where conflict risks outweigh cooperation benefits. Steel tariffs may have been sold as tools to protect American workers, but their actual legacy is fractured partnership, billions in destroyed value, and a future defined by suspicion rather than trust.